Welcome to the architectural masterclass of the Indian nation-state. Unlike standard systems of governance, the Indian constitution engineers a unique mechanism, a dynamic equilibrium carefully balanced between centralized authority, represented here in the golden structural core, and regional autonomy, built into the foundational terracotta outer structures. Let's disassemble this administrative machinery to see how it operates in practice. To understand India's architecture, we must contrast it with classic federalism like the United States. The US is an indestructible union of indestructible states, born out of independent entities bargaining to form a nation. India, however, is an indestructible union of destructible states. Here is the key constitutional insight: the word federal never actually appears in the text of the Constitution. Instead, Article 1 strictly defines India as a union of states. The intent? The states are not the result of an independent agreement, rather, the country created its states for administrative convenience. The union is permanent, but state boundaries can be rewritten. This brings us to a complex structural duality. When we weigh the constitutional scales, we find a deliberate mix of traits. On the autonomous side of the ledger, India boasts distinct federal features: a dual government framework dividing power between the center and states, a written or supreme constitution, a rigid amendment process for matters affecting states, and a bicameral legislation. But look closely, the scale tilts heavily toward centralization. The unitary features are formidable: a single citizenship or single constitution, an integrated judiciary, residuary powers vested completely with the center, and sweeping emergency provisions under Articles 352, 356, and 360. Power in India doesn't flow at random, it is organized across a threefold architectural framework derived directly from the Constitution. First, legislative relations under Articles 245 to 255 define who makes the laws. Second, administrative relations under Articles 256 to 263 map out executive execution. Third, financial relations under Articles 268 to 293 dictate revenue distribution. This architecture ensures that neither the center nor the state operates in a legal vacuum. Let's examine the legislative pillar through a strict division of fields. The seventh schedule splits authority into a precise mapping. The Union List contains 98 subjects of national importance like defense, foreign affairs, and currency, where the center has exclusive rule. The State List covers 59 subjects tailored for local governance, including police, public health, and agriculture. Where they overlap is the Concurrent List, containing 52 subjects like education, criminal law, and marriage, where both can legislate. However, notice the overarching control systems. Article 248 awards all residuary powers, any subject not explicitly listed, directly to the center. Furthermore, the principle of supremacy dictates that in any case of conflict or overlap, the Union List always prevails over the State List. The systemic tilt toward central supremacy becomes absolute through explicit legal overrides. Under Article 254, when central and state laws clash on a concurrent subject, parliamentary law automatically supersedes state law. Beyond this hierarchy, the center holds 4 constitutional keys to unlock and legislate directly over the state list itself. Article 249 allows it if the Rajya Sabha passes a 2/3 majority resolution. Article 250 triggers this override automatically during a national emergency. Article 252 opens the door when 2 or more states formally request it. And Article 253 gives Parliament the power to pass state-level laws to implement international treaties. Moving to administration, the system functions like a centralized command wheel. Under Articles 256 and 257, the center issues binding executive directives. States are constitutionally required to exercise their executive power to ensure compliance with parliamentary laws and must never impede the Union's executive path. Activating the administrative backbone is what we call the central nervous system. Article 312 establishes the All India Services, the IAS, IPS, and IFS. These elite officers are recruited and managed by the center, yet they run the day-to-day administration of the states. To prevent total friction, a cooperative bridge exists under Article 263, the Interstate Council, engineered to resolve disputes and promote coordination outside the formal judicial system. Perhaps the most critical point of structural tension is the financial architecture, which resembles a complex plumbing network. The center possesses the most lucrative tax domains, creating a built-in vertical fiscal imbalance where states hold vast responsibilities but limited revenue streams. To balance this, the plumbing utilizes two main routes. Under Articles 268 and 269, certain taxes are levied by the center but flow directly to the states, such as stamp duties and integrated GST. The primary revenue pool, however, flows under Article 270 into central collection and must be shared. The ultimate calibrator here is the Finance Commission under Article 280. Appointed every 5 years, this independent body dictates the exact formula for horizontal and vertical tax devaluations, ensuring the central pool equalizes the financial needs of the individual state buckets. Despite these elaborate calibrations, the high concentration of central authority creates deep friction points across the political landscape. 5 structural faults frequently trigger tension between the center and the regions. First, allegations of discriminatory and partisan roles played by center-appointed governors. Second, financial leverage, seen in the allegedly partisan distribution of discretionary grants. Third, the center establishing investigative inquiry commissions against sitting state chief ministers. Fourth, the deployment of central armed police forces into states without local consent. And fifth, legislative vetoes, where governors reserve state-passed bills indefinitely for the president's consideration under Article 200. Let's focus on the absolute linchpin of this structural tension, the office of the governor. The position embodies a profound constitutional paradox. On one hand, the governor is the objective constitutional head of state, required to act strictly on the advice of the local chief minister and council. On the other hand, the governor functions as an active agent of the center, appointed by and serving entirely at the pleasure of the president. Because the appointment and dismissal process is fully controlled by the ruling party at the center, this institutional duality creates immense partisan friction, especially during hung assemblies or state political crises. When friction turns into a breakdown, the center can pull the ultimate override lever. Article 356, commonly known as President's Rule. The mechanism is absolute. If the constitutional machinery in a state fails, the state executive is summarily dismissed, and parliament completely assumes the state's legislative powers. Historically, this emergency gear has faced severe criticism for misuse, having been deployed 128 times since independence, frequently to topple rival political state governments. However, a vital judicial safeguard arrived in 1994 with the landmark S.R. Bommai case. The Supreme Court established that the activation of Article 356 is subject to strict judicial review, and state assemblies cannot be dissolved until Parliament explicitly approves the presidential proclamation. To address these systemic vulnerabilities, major review mechanisms were launched. In 1983, the Sarkaria Commission was formed to recalibrate the shifting scales of federal power. The commission provided key structural fixes across 4 critical areas. For governor appointments, it recommended that the appointee must be an eminent figure from outside the state, detached from recent active politics, and chosen only after consulting the state's chief minister. For governor dismissals, it urged a guaranteed 5-year tenure, stating governors should not be removed arbitrarily without compelling reasons and a fair chance to explain. For emergencies, it ordered that Article 356 must strictly serve as an absolute last resort, only after exhausting all other options. And for hung assemblies, it established a strict 4-step protocol for inviting parties to form a government, prioritizing clear pre-poll alliances to prevent political horse trading. As India's political economy evolved, a modern calibration was required. In 2007, the Poonchi Commission advanced the blueprint further to meet 21st century challenges. First, it introduced the concept of localized emergencies, arguing that instead of dissolving an entire state under Article 356, the center should use a localized framework to isolate and contain crises within specific districts. Second, it addressed the infamous pocket veto by proposing strict legislative time limits, forcing governors to decide on reserving a bill for the president within a clear 6-month window. Third, it recommended stripping non-constitutional roles from the governor, such as serving as the chancellor of state universities, to reduce daily friction with state cabinets. Finally, it emphasized a consensus bridge, demanding the center seek broad agreements through the Interstate Council before passing laws on concurrent subjects. When we place both commissions side by side in a master reform matrix, we see a clear evolution in constitutional thought. While Sarkaria sought to protect the governor's 5-year tenure by requiring stated reasons before a removal, Poonchi evolved the idea further, recommending a formal impeachment process for governors similar to that of the president. For emergency rule, Sarkaria wanted Article 356 kept as a last resort. Poonchi pushed to abandon statewide shutdowns in favor of localized, targeted interventions. And on state legislation under Article 200, where Sarkaria asked the president to provide reasons for withholding assent, Poonchi targeted the route delay by proposing a strict 6-month time limit on the governor's power to reserve bills. Ultimately, the Indian blueprint functions exactly like a sophisticated dual-mode gearbox. As the chief architect of the Constitution, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, profoundly stated, the Indian Constitution is federal during peacetime and unitary during emergencies. When the nation is stable, it operates smoothly in Mode 1, a decentralized federal mode honoring regional diversity. But the moment a national crisis strikes, the internal gears shift seamlessly into Mode 2, a centralized unitary mode designed for swift survival. The friction we observe in Indian federalism is a feature, not a bug. It is a deliberately calibrated tension engineered to ensure regional autonomy in times of prosperity, and singular national resilience in times of crisis. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, comment if you enjoyed this quick revision.